Hello and welcome to this playthrough video of Dreaded Flags, Naval Conflict in the Age of Piracy. My name is Wouter, I'm the designer and graphic artist for the game. And to get the most out of this playthrough, I suggest you read through the rules, grab the components and set up everything for the tutorial mission, and then just simply follow along. First up, let's take a look at some of the components that you need to play the game. Obviously, you need the book. In the book, you find the scenario booklet, and we are going to play the tutorial mission, The Merchant. We'll show you a couple of turns for that. You also need the map and some counters or ships. As you can see, I don't play on the map as provided in the book, but I play on my own map because they go well with the miniatures. And if you wonder about those, these are handmade, homemade, and you find the designs for these on the War Artisan website. Okay, so besides these, you also need the locks. You also find these in the book. The book comes with locks for every scenario. There's one set available, but as you can see, we're going to write on them, so you will need spare ones. You find those on the Board Game Geek. There's the usual setup, so we have the wind speed and wind change number over here, and I placed the wind vane as indicated by the setup of the game, of the scenario, in the corner over here. And that's about it to start the game. And for this tutorial we are looking at the scenario called The Merchant. It's the tutorial mission for the game. It's an encounter between a merchant ship and a pirate somewhere late 1710s. So over here we have the setup instructions for the scenario. First thing you need to do is set up the merchant ship. We already done that. And there's an optional setup, and this is the setup we will be using for the tutorial. Let's take a look at some of the victory conditions. The scenario takes 10 turns, but it's possible to have an early victory in case the Sarah, that's the ship of the merchant player, if she exits the map, the merchant is victorious. If that doesn't happen before the end of turn 10, in that case, we will be scoring the victory points. For the pirates, those are victory points for damage on the Sarah. They're punished if they have too much damage in crew squares. And for the merchant, if they're able to do some damage on the ranger, they get victory points for that. So we'll be playing this one solo. Both sides have clear objectives, so that works very easy. We have two ships only, so the pirates have the ranger, which is a fast ship, as you can see on the log. By these statistics, this indicates it's a fast ship. Then we have the merchant player. They have the Sarah, and that's a regular ship. So let's take a look to the ship log. This way you can compare the two ships. If you play this with two players, you would cut along this line and give each player a part of the log. For the Sarah, you can see she has a slightly larger hull than the ranger. Her morale is unprepared because they're getting attacked by pirates, and the pirates, they have a confident morale, obviously. Another difference is the guns. To start the scenario, you have to roll a die and see the number of guns you get for the setup. So we rolled a 6, so we have 6 guns on each broadside. The ranger, they have slightly more guns. You can also see that the Sarah has already 1 hull square damage over here. When we take a look at the log, we already played 2 turns. So in turn 1, the Sarah used 3 movement points, spending movement forward, and she did the same for the second turn. Compare this to the log of the ranger. In the first turn, the ranger moved 2 hexes forward, turned to the right, and moved another additional hex. And to do this, they used a crew focus, as you can see by this box that is ticked off. In the second turn, she moved 2 hexes forward, moved to the left, and moved 1 movement point forward. For this one, she didn't need to use the crew focus. You can also see by the slash through the ammunition column on the right, she fired her right broadside already. Which means we start this scenario in turn 3. As you can see by the ships, they are really close together, so now we are in for a bit of action. So first up is the planning phase, and during the planning phase players can plan movement and plan for repairs. And for this turn it's pretty straightforward. Like I said, both sides have clear objectives. So the Sarah, which is the ship over here, she wants to exit the map, while the pirates obviously want to deal as much damage to the ship as possible and perhaps try and capture the ship. So the Sarah will spend 3 movement points moving forward. So she writes a 3 over here. Now the Ranger will move 1 hex forward, move to the left, and then move another 2 hexes forward. And to do this, they will need to use crew focus. So they now have to mark off the crew focus box for the 3rd turn. So why is that? Let's take a look. Currently the ship is sailing in attitude C, as you can see by the indicated by the wind vane over here. And this ship has only 3 movement points to begin the turn with. So the first one is spent moving forward, the second one is spent by turning to the left, and the third one is again spent moving forward. So to use an extra movement point, they tick off the box for the crew focus. Remember, this is only possible if a ship is doing some planned movement in attitude C or B, which is the case as the ship is now sailing currently in attitude C. So both ships have now locked their movement, planned their movement. So this brings us to the movement phase. So let's move the Sarah. Three hexes forward. Now move the Ranger. 1 hex forward. Turn to the left. And 2 hexes forward. Now the ships are really close together, but there's no collision. And now players can state if they want to grapple, try and grapple the ship. But now the ship is going to try and grapple the other one. It's too early on, and the Ranger wants to deal a lot more of damage to the Sarah. Which takes us to the combat phase. So the first sub-phase of the combat phase is the cannon fire phase. Now, broadsides of every ship are loaded, so they can fire at each other. Fire is simultaneous, but we start with the guns of the Sarah. The Sarah is firing her left broadside. She has 6 guns, which means she can roll 2 dice. She's firing at a range 1, so she needs to roll a hit number 3 or higher. And she can also roll for a captain casualty check if she scores at least 1 hit, because of the plus C indicator you can see on the chart. But because this is her first broadside, on the left side, she gets an additional die. Let's take a look at the other modifiers. So crew loss, you lose 1 die per lost crew section. But as you can see on the log of the Sarah, there's no crew damage here for the moment, so this does not apply. There's also 1 die less if there's a storm, but that's not the case, as you can see by the wind speed on the log. It's wind speed 3, so that's no storm at the moment. If it would be a rake, you have a +1 to the result of all your dice. It's not a rake. Let me show you what could apply as a rake in this game. I explain it with this third ship. Now, if the Sarah would fire at this ship, this would be a rake. another rake would be this situation. Those are the only two situations in which a rake is allowed in this game. So very simple, those are the only two ones, and they don't apply at the moment. So if she would fire at a small ship, there would be a -1 to all her results. It's not the case now. If the wind speed would be gale, there would be also a -1 to each die, which is also not the case. And if her crew morale would be scared, she would have a -1 on one of her scored results. Remember, you can never modify natural 1. There's one other modifier. If her crew was confident, she would have a +1 to one of her dice, which is not the case, but this will be the case for the Ranger later on. So back to the cannon fire of the Sarah. She has 3 dice, so her base number was 2 dice, and a third one because it's the initial broadside. And she has to roll a number 3 or higher, and if she has 1 hit, she can roll for Captain Casualty. Okay, let's roll the dice. So she rolled a 1, a 2, and a 5, which is 1 hit. Why is that? So the 1 result, you cannot modify this. She needed to roll 3 or higher. So this one is a miss. We remove that one. We're left with these 2. The 5 is a hit. She needed to roll 3 or higher, but the 2, that one is too low. Now, the Sarah chooses to use her crew focus to reroll one of her dice during this cannon fire phase. So I mark it off on the log, and this allows her to reroll one of her dice. But remember, you cannot never reroll a natural 1. She now rolled a 3. So 2 hits. If you take a look at the hits chart, the first hit is always a rigging hit. Let's mark that off on the Ranger. So the first one is a rigging hit. The second hit could either be a hull or a crew hit, and the Sarah chooses 1 crew hit. Now she scored at least 1 hit, so she can roll for a Captain Casualty check. So let's roll. She rolled a 4, which means that's another crew hit. Now the Sarah has to mark off her left broadside, so we're drawing a slash through the left ammunition column. Now it's time for the cannon fire of the Ranger. They have 7 guns on this broadside, which means they can roll 3 dice to begin with. Now let's take a look at some of the modifiers. Again, it's range 1, so they have to roll a hit number of 3 or higher. Plus they can roll for a Captain Casualty check if they score at least 1 hit, as indicated by the +C indicator. It's not their initial broadside, so they don't get the additional die, as was the case with the Sarah. But they are confident, so they get a +1 on one of their dice. So let's roll. So we rolled a 2, a 2, and a 3, which is also only 1 hit, because they needed to roll a 3 or higher. Now, the crew focus was already used during movement phase. As you can see, it's marked off, so they cannot use the crew focus to reroll one of their dice, which the Sarah did previously. But remember, they did have the modifier to adjust one of the dice results by adding a +1. So from this 2, we make a 3, which means they also score 2 hits at the moment. Now let's take a look at which hits we scored. The first hit is always a rigging hit. And for the second hit, the Ranger picks the hull hit. They also scored at least 1 hit, so they also can roll for the Captain Casualty check. For Captain Casualty, they rolled a 3, which is the first crew hit. Now, as you can see, let's zoom in a bit. On the first square of the Sarah, there's an M indicated, which means they have to take a morale check when this square is marked off. So there's some damage now. So the Sarah has to roll at the end of the cannon fire phase, which is actually now, as both sides have fired. So we can finalize the damage by drawing a second slash. And now let's roll for the morale check of the Sarah. So how does this work? In the chart, you see the morale check table. First, you look up the morale of the defender. In this case, it's the Sarah, and they are unprepared. Next, you take a look at the difference between the crew sections. So the Ranger has 7 crew, while the Sarah has 10 crew left, which is a difference of 3. The defender has 3 more, so they need to roll a 3 or higher. Let's take a look. So they rolled a 1, that's not enough, which means that the morale is going to drop 1 level. And we do this by marking off the morale and replacing it with the next one. So from unprepared, they become scared. So basically what happened is the pirates fired at close range, dealt some damage, and it really scared the crew of the Sarah. There's one more thing to do. The Ranger has to mark off the right ammo column. This concludes the combat phase because this ends the cannon fire phase. There is no musket fire because the ships don't have musketeers, and there is no boarding because the ships didn't grapple this turn. So this brings us to the fourth phase, the housekeeping phase. There's not too much to do this housekeeping phase. The only thing we need to do is to reload. So we draw another R at the next turn, which is the 4th turn. The R is for round shot. There is no special ammunition in this game. So next thing we need to do is to roll for wind change. So if we roll the wind change number, which is 7, then there's a possibility that the wind is going to change by speed and by direction. So we rolled a 5, so there is no wind change. So this brings us to turn 4, as you can see, and we start with the planning phase. So it's time for the Sarah. She will move 1 hex forward. Why is that? Remember, you can always slow down your ship. There's no need to move all the movement points. She could do that and try to outrun the Ranger, but remember, the Ranger is a fast ship. They are currently sailing in attitude A, both ships, which means in this attitude the Ranger is faster than the Sarah. Let's take a look for the Ranger. The Ranger is going to move 2 hexes forward and then make a turn to the right, hoping to cut off the Sarah. Which brings us to the movement phase. I forgot one thing. The Sarah will try and do a hull repair. So she writes this in her remarks column. HR stands for hull repair, and she is going to attempt this in turn 4. So okay, let's move the ships. Sarah is going to move 1 hex forward. And the Ranger is moving 2 hexes forward and turning to the right. Okay, it's the end of the movement phase now, and this time the Ranger is going to try and grapple the Sarah. As for the attempt, they now write this in the log, a G. Now let's take a look at the modifiers that come into play when they try and grapple. Both captains are still alive, so they get a +1 on the die roll. They do have a higher morale than the defending ship. Yes, they are confident, while the morale of the Sarah is scared at the moment, so that's a +2 on the die roll. If it would be wind speed, gale or storm, which isn't the case, then there would be a -1 because it's harder to grapple during stormy weather. So let's roll a die. And on a 1, they failed the grapple attempt, so we're going to update this in the log. I marked this with a 0, so there's no grapple chips at the moment. Which concludes the movement phase. Now let's move into the combat phase. First of all, the Sarah will not try and fire because she will attempt to do a hull repair in the housekeeping phase, and one of the conditions is that you do not fire during this turn because you need all your crew for the reparations on your ship, so you don't have crew left for the cannon fire. So no cannon fire on that ship. Now let's take a look at the Ranger. So we have 7 guns that come into play. As you remember, 7 guns, that means we can roll 3 dice. It's again a range 1 because we always count the shortest range. So the hit number is 3 or higher, and we can roll for a casualty, a captain casualty, if he scored at least 1 hit. It's not the initial broadside anymore, as you know, so we don't have that modifier, but we still have a confident crew, so we can add a +1 to any one die that we roll. So let's roll. Now for this specific cannon fire, I will show you how the optional rule works. There's one chart that will show you the advanced hit table, and this one we are going to use just for this cannon fire phase, so you see how it works. To do this, we follow the same procedure, but we will add 2 colored dice to the mix. And before I roll, I have to state whether I'm aiming at the hull or at the rigging. And I'm going to aim at the hull. So let's roll the dice. So this is the result. Let's take a look at what this means. We have a 5, 5 and a 3, which means we have 3 hits because hit number was 3 at this range and we rolled higher. So we have 3 hits. Now for the advanced hit table, we rolled 7 with our colored dice. We stated we aimed at the hull, which is a -3, which leaves us with a 4 result. Now if we check 3 hits with a 4 result in that table, we have 1 hull hit and 2 crew hits. So let's mark those off. Now we scored at least 1 hit, so we can roll for the captain casualty. And on a roll of 6, the captain of the Sarah is killed. So let's make a notation in the log for this. So we simply write captain killed. When this happens, this is going to be a modifier for a number of things, but when this happens, usually you should also strike through the current morale and replace it with 1 lower, but they are already scared, so there's no lower morale in this game than the scared morale, so this has no effect at the moment. So this concludes the combat phase, which brings us to the housekeeping phase. The Ranger fired, so I forgot to place a marker. And they write an R in the next turn for the reload. So again, round shot in turn 5, and both broadsides are now loaded. Now for the housekeeping phase, as you remember, the Sarah will try and attempt a hull repair. So let's take a look at how this works. So if there's an unsurrendered enemy ship within 3 hexes, there's a -1, so that's the case. And for every consecutive attempt of the same repair, so that's very important, it has to be the same repair and it has to be consecutive, there's a +1 for each attempt. It's the first time she attempts a hull repair, so she does not get the +1, and the enemy ship is within 3 hexes, so there's a -1 on the die roll. And one way to enhance the die roll is to use the crew focus. As you can see, the Sarah did not use crew focus this turn so far, so she can use it now. And to do so, she marks off the box with an X. And this means she gets a +1 to the die roll, which negates the -1. Let's roll. On the roll of 5, it's a success. 5 or higher, and she rolls a 5. So that's a success. And to indicate the repaired hull, we draw one extra square, one additional square. And this is a success. So I put an exclamation mark next to it. That way you can keep track whether attempt for a repair was a success or not. So we're done with the repair attempts. It's time to roll for the wind change. Remember, on a roll of 7, we have a change in wind direction and or wind speed. So we roll the 7, wind is going to change. Now let's roll 2 dice, one for the direction, one for the speed. We rolled a 5 for wind change, and as you can see, it says wind changes 60 degrees counterclockwise. So we update the wind vane to indicate this. Now let's roll 1 die for the wind speed change. We rolled a 5, which brings the wind speed to a 4. So we update the log that has the that keeps track of the wind speed. We replace it with a 4. Now this specific wind speed only has effect if you have musket fire. So there's no musketeers in this scenario, so the 4 doesn't change anything to the game for now. And this concludes the 4th turn, which brings us to turn 5. So again, turn 5, we kick off with the planning phase. Now let's take a look. Possibilities for the Sarah. She is going to move to the right and then try and attempt to move 1 hex forward. And the Ranger is simply moving 1 hex forward. So let's move the ships. The Sarah turns to the right, moves 1 hex forward. The Ranger moves 1 hex forward. Obviously, the Ranger will do another grappling attempt, so let's write it down in the log. Let's take a look at the modifier. The captain is still alive, so they have a +1. Remember that the captain got killed on board of the Sarah, not on the Ranger. And the Ranger also has the higher morale. They have a confident morale versus a scared morale. So they have a +2 on the die. They really want to grapple the ship, so they will spend the crew focus, ticking off the box, which is another +1 for a grappling attempt. So they have a +3 on the die. And they need to roll a 5 or higher. They rolled a 5, which means a successful grappling attempt. So they grappled the Sarah. Can indicate it with a marker. Also put an exclamation mark next to it. And I also write it in the lock of the Sarah that she is grappled. Which brings us to the combat phase. When with grapple chips, remember that fire is possible as long as the broadsides are loaded, but as long as ships are grappled, they cannot reload. So at the moment, both ships have all their broadsides loaded, so they can fire at one another. Let's take a look at the Sarah. She will try and defend herself. So she has 6 guns, which means she can roll 2 dice. The range is 1, so they need to roll 3 or higher. If they score at least 1 hit, they can roll for a captain casualty. And when we take a look at the modifiers, we see that the morale is now scared, so they have a -1 to 1 of the die rolls. Let's roll. So she rolled a 3 and a 5. She has to do a -1 on one of her dice, so she picks the 5 obviously, which means both are still a hit. So she scores 2 hits, not bad with a scared crew. So the first hit is always a rigging hit, and a second hit she can choose between a hull hit or a crew hit, and she's expecting to see some boarding actions, so she decides to pick the crew hit. She scored at least 1 hit, so she can now roll for the captain casualty. She rolls a 5, which is another hit for a crew square. So now the Sarah marks off her left broadside. So this one is now empty and cannot be reloaded at the end of the combat phase. Now let's take a look at the cannon fire from the Ranger. They have 7 guns still, so they roll 3 dice. They have to roll 3 or higher since the range is still 1. If they score at least 1 hit, they can roll for the captain casualty. As for modifiers, they have confident morale, so they have a +1 to 1 of their dice. Let's roll. They rolled a 1, a 2 and a 5. Remember, natural ones cannot be modified. They are always misses, so we remove that one. So we can adjust this 2 with the +1 for the confident morale, which brings it to a 3, which means there are 2 hits. The first hit is always a rigging hit, so we take that damage on the lock of the Sarah. As for a second hit, they pick the crew hit. Now they scored at least 1 hit, so they can roll for captain casualty. On a roll of 1, it's a miss, so nothing's happening there. Now both ships finalize the damage. Now let's take a look at some of the damage. As you can see on the lock of the Ranger, there's 1 crew section that is completely eliminated. This is going to be 1 less die in cannon fire combat. And the same applies for the Sarah. They also have 1 crew section that is completely gone. So they also roll -1 in future during future cannon fire, as you can see on the modifiers on the cannon fire chart. So this concludes the cannon fire. There is no musket fire subphase, which brings us to the boarding action. So let's take a look at how boarding works. Both ships will roll their dice simultaneously. You take into account the morale on the ship and the number of crew squares that are available. So let's take a look at the Sarah. They are scared and they have 7 squares left, so they roll 2 dice. But because they are scared, they need to roll a 6 to score at least 1 hit. As opposed to the Ranger, where the morale is still confident, they only have 5 squares left, which means they only roll 1 die, but because they are confident, they need to roll a 3 or higher, and if they score at least 1 hit, they get a second roll for a Captain Casualty check. So let's roll the die and see what happens. So the roll for the Sarah is a 6 and a 3. She needs to roll at least a 6, which means she has 1 hit. Now in the boarding phase, it's very important to know that it's when you score 1 hit, you deal 2 squares of crew damage. If you score 2 hits, you hit 7 crew squares, and if you roll 3 hits, you hit 7 crew squares. So she has 1 hit, which means she scores 2 squares of damage, crew squares of damage on the Ranger. Now the Ranger has only 1 die to roll, so they can score a maximum of 2 squares if they roll a 3 or higher. Now they roll a 6, so 2 hits for the Sarah, and they get another roll for the Captain Casualty check, and they roll a 4, which deals another square of damage. This concludes the boarding action phase, and both ships finalize the damage. As you can see, there's a second section for the Ranger that is now a crew section that is now gone, which means they roll 2 dice less during the cannon fire subphase. Which takes us to the housekeeping phase. There are no repairs planned. Reloading is not possible since the ships are grappled together, and the only thing that is left for now is to roll for wind change. We rolled an 11, that's not the same as 7, so the wind does not change. And this concludes turn 5. I would say that there's a big chance that the Ranger will win this game. And so this concludes the tutorial of Dreaded Flags. If you have any questions concerning rules or otherwise, you can always find me on Board Game Geek. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you find it informative.